She was 21 years old, and for all the world cared, invisible. She had no parents left to speak of. Her mother gone when she was 3, her father the winter after, and no one in the village of Harrow's Cove, Nova Scotia, who felt obligated to see her as anything more than the old boat builder's odd little shadow. What she had was a draw knife with a boxwood handle, worn smooth by 40 years of another man's grip, and $12 folded inside her boot. And with what little she had left, after paying what she owed, she spent 8 of those dollars on the salvage rights to a waterlogged, half-sunken dory, rotting in the mud of a tidal creek no one had bothered to name. But what nobody in Harrow's Cove knew, what they could not see from the safe, dry distance of the wharf as they laughed at her, was that beneath the dory's false hull planking lay a secret that would unmake the most powerful man in the county and build Selah Dunbar a life from the wreckage of someone else's crime. Settle in close, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Selah Dunbar was not born to the gray salt air of the Nova Scotia shoreline, but she had been shaped by it the way a piece of green wood is shaped by the hands of a patient craftsman, slowly, under pressure, into something useful. She had arrived in Harrow's Cove at age 6, sent from a Halifax cousin's house to live with her great-uncle Abel Ketty, a boat carpenter whose reputation for tight joinery and honest work was as solid as the white oak keels he laid. He was a widower and a quiet man, the kind who communicated more with his tools than with words. But he had seen something in the small girl watching him plane a plank, the way she went still, the way her eyes tracked the curl of shaving lifting from the wood, and he had let her stay close. For 15 years she learned, first the names, spokeshave, rabbit plane, caulking iron, brace and bit, then the feel, the grain of spruce versus fir, the way you read a board by looking down its length in the light, the difference between a plank that wants to bend and one that will crack if you push it. Abel Ketty taught her to caulk a seam so tight it would not weep for 20 years, to shape a knee from a crook of hackmatack, to swing a mallet with her whole body and not just her arms. He gave her the draw knife on her 14th birthday, a fine old Sheffield blade with a handle he had turned himself from a piece of boxwood. He said it had belonged to his own father and his father's father before that. It was the only thing anyone had ever given her that was made with intention, for her specifically, and she kept it wrapped in oilcloth and carried it everywhere. When Abel Ketty died of a stroke the November before last, quietly, in the chair beside the stove, as if he had simply decided to stop, the only real shelter Selah had ever known was suddenly uncertain. The workshop was his, and the cottage beside it. He had no will on paper, only his wishes spoken aloud and a handshake agreement with the village. Selah had assumed, perhaps naively, that what was his would simply pass to her. She was the only one who had ever come to the workshop with any regularity. She was the only one who knew how to run it. Victor Murchie had other ideas. Murchie was the fish merchant of Harrow's Cove, a man who owned the salt house, the ice house, the general store, and the dock. He was not a large man physically, but he had the kind of controlled stillness that made a room feel smaller when he entered it. He had advanced Abel Ketty supplies over the years, paint and oakum and bolts and lengths of copper rod, and he had kept the running account with careful, elegant penmanship in a ledger he kept behind the counter of the store. After Abel died, he produced that ledger and opened it to a page that made Selah's throat close. The total showed 14 years of accumulated debt, compounded at a rate no one had ever agreed to in writing. The cottage and workshop were listed as collateral, in a clause written at the bottom of the first entry, in ink that was a slightly different shade than the rest. She was given 48 hours to vacate both premises, or the debt would be referred to the county court. Selah did not weep. She had spent enough of her childhood doing that quietly in corners to know it changed nothing. She looked at the ledger, looked at Murchie's careful face, and nodded once. She asked for a copy of the page. He said the ledger was not to leave the store. She memorized what she could and walked out. The rest of that day and the next, she moved with the quiet efficiency of someone dismantling a life they had always half expected to lose. She cleaned the workshop floor. She oiled the tools she would have to leave behind, the big adze, the long ripping saw, the steam box, and hung them on their hooks in the order Abel Ketty had always kept them. A man from Murchie's store arrived to inventory the equipment. He lingered over the good tools with the eyes of someone calculating resale value and offered her $12 for everything. She took it without haggling, knowing it was robbery, knowing it didn't matter. She packed what was hers, her clothes, the oilcloth roll with the draw knife inside, a small tin of beeswax and linseed she had mixed herself, a mug she had bought in Bridgewater 3 summers ago. She walked out before dawn on the second morning and did not look at the workshop door as she pulled it shut behind her. She had $12 in a craft and no roof. She walked south along the shore path into the low country where the headlands broke apart into tidal marshes and kelp beds. The air was cold and clean in the way that October air is clean in Nova Scotia, sharp enough to wake something up behind your sternum. She walked until the village sounds faded, and the only sounds were the tide lapping on the gravel and the harsh call of a herring gull banking overhead. She found the old Dory in a tidal creek called Gull Run, half a mile below the last of the fish shacks. It had been there at least 2 full seasons. Everyone in Harrow's Cove knew it in the vague way that people know landmarks they have stopped actually seeing. The wrecked Dory in the marsh, as fixed a part of the landscape as the alders leaning over the bank. The hull was weathered gray, canted hard to port in the mud, half filled with black water and dead sedge. One oarlock was missing, the thwarts had gone soft. But she walked around it twice in the calf-deep marsh water, and she saw what no one laughing from a distance had bothered to look for. The hull planking was cedar on the topsides, which was right. But where the planks met the floor timbers near the bow, the wood was different, darker, close-grained, fitted with an exactness that ordinary construction did not need and would not spend the time to produce. Someone had built something inside the visible thing. She knew the difference between a boat built for use and a boat built to conceal. She went back to the village and spent 4 of her $12 on salvage rights from the harbor master. A transaction he recorded with a raised eyebrow and no comment. She spent 2 more on a length of block and tackle rope at the hardware. The people of Harrow's Cove were not cruel. Exactly. They were practical, the way communities that live at the edge of the weather learn to be practical. And what they saw from the dock road looked impractical beyond all sense. A young woman alone in a tidal marsh in October, up to her knees in black mud, running rope around a half-sunken dory that had been sitting there long enough to grow a reputation. The first morning, 2 men on their way to the wharf stopped and watched without saying anything. The second morning, a teenager threw a stone into the water nearby and shouted something she didn't catch. The third morning, one of the older fishermen, a man named Bart Can, whose word carried weight on the dock, leaned on the fence rail above the marsh and called out, not unkindly, but not gently either. "You know that thing has been sitting there since before Silas Purdy went missing, girl. What in the world do you think you're going to do with it?" She did not answer. She reset her pulley anchor in the root of a big alder and went back to work. The work was the kind that breaks you if you think about it all at once, so she did not think about it all at once. She thought about the next 6 inches. She had rigged a block and tackle using the alder and a second anchor driven into solid ground at the marsh edge, the rope running to the dory's bow ring. She dug the mud from around the hull with a flat piece of driftwood, working slowly in the cold water. She winched the rope, felt the system creak, and the dory shift and groan against the mud. Then she would dig again, move the anchor, and haul again. On the first day, the dory moved 4 feet. On the second day, 8. On the third afternoon, with the cold coming down early the way it does in October. On that coast, the dory came up out of the mud with a long, wet tearing sound and bumped onto the flat gravel bar she had been working it toward. She stood in the creek with water around her ankles and looked at it, breathing hard. The mocking voice from the fence rail above was gone. There was nobody on the road at all, just the marsh and the dory and the darkening sky, and the herring gulls riding the wind above the kelp beds. She slept in an abandoned fish shack nearby, that night, the drawknife under her jacket, and the next morning she began the careful work of taking the dory apart. She went slowly. She had the drawknife, a small pry bar, and a brace with 2 bits she had found in the shack, and she used them the way Abel Ketty had taught her, with patience, reading the wood before she touched it, feeling for the grain in the fastening. She pulled the rotten thwarts and set them aside. She worked the floorboards, which lifted without much difficulty, being swollen and soft. It was when she reached the bow section that she stopped. She had been tapping along the hull planks with the handle of the drawknife. A habit Abel had instilled in her: always knock before you cut, listen to what the wood tells you. And near the stem, just forward of where the floor timbers ended, the sound changed. Not the flat knock of solid wood backed by mud. A lower, drier sound. She tapped again, moving the knuckle of her hand along a line 6 inches wide, then again. Hollow. She set the draw knife down and ran her fingers along the seam where the planking met the internal frame. The joinery was too fine. Not shipyard work, cabinet work, the kind a man makes when he needs something to stay hidden. She found the edge by feel, a seam so close-fitted she could not get a thumbnail into it. She pressed along it methodically, the way you test a door with no visible handle, and 6 inches from the stem she felt a small iron pin set flush with the wood. She pressed it. A panel approximately 2 feet by 18 inches, lifted on a single pivot hinge, silent on its bearing, swinging up as if it had been waiting. Her breath left her. Inside the cavity was a space lined with tarred canvas over oilskin, bone dry despite everything the Marsh had thrown at it. 3 objects rested inside: tin biscuit box sealed with wax around the lid, a coil of papers tied with cord, and a small canvas bag that chinked when she lifted it, the unmistakable weight and voice of coin. She sat down on the gravel bar, the October wind pressing against her back, and she opened each thing in turn. The tin box held a private ledger. 2 columns of figures on each page, written in a careful hand she recognized, after a moment, the same careful hand that had written her great-uncle's debt into a ledger behind the counter at the store. The left column bore the numbers the Harrow's Cove fishing pool had been recording for 3 years: catches, landed weights, payout shares. The right column bore different numbers, the true numbers, annotated in the margins with brief, damning notes. Reported fee £400, actual £2,100, balance to VM. 37 such entries, season after season. Victor Murchie had been falsifying the pool records, skimming the difference in landed catch weight from every boat in the harbor for 3 full years. The coil of papers was a letter, or the draft of one, addressed to the federal fisheries inspector for the district. It was signed at the bottom, Silas Purdy, dated 11 months ago. Silas Purdy. The man on the fence rail had said that name without thinking. The man everyone in Harrow's Cove said had gone missing at sea the previous January. The letter described the discrepancies Purdy had found in Murchie's pool accounts, the evidence he had gathered, the Dory with the hidden panel where he had stored it, his intention to bring it to the inspector on his next trip to Lunenburg. The letter had never been sent. The canvas bag held $63 in silver coin. Selah sat with the papers in her lap and the cold wind in her face and understood what she was holding. Not treasure. Evidence, the kind that could only mean one of 2 things. Either Silas Purdy had hidden this here deliberately before something happened to him, or he had hidden it here and then something had happened to him. And the 2 things were not separate at all. She put everything back into the cavity, closed the panel, and sat very still while the tide turned below the marsh, and the gulls swept low over the gravel bar without noticing her. She was not foolish enough to think the contents of that false hull made her safe. She understood, as clearly as she had understood the clause in Murchie's ledger, written in a different shade of ink, that a man, willing to rob his own fishing community for 3 years would not hesitate to act against a 21-year-old woman alone in a marsh. She needed to move first. She needed someone outside Murchie's reach. The federal fisheries inspector for their district was a man named Frederick Stamp. He came through Harrow's Cove twice a year on his circuit, staying 2 nights at the boarding house and reviewing the weigh records at the salt house. His next scheduled visit was 3 weeks away, but she had learned from a lifetime of listening from doorways that he kept an office in Lunenburg, 40 miles west. She wrapped the papers and the ledger in the oilcloth from her draw knife, tucked the tin box and the canvas bag inside her jacket, and walked the 40 miles in 2 days. She ate the heel of a bread loaf from her pack and slept one night in a barn whose owner never knew she was there. When she reached Lunenburg, she was cold and stiff, and her left boot had worn through at the heel, and she walked into the fisheries office on Montague Street and asked for Frederick Stamp by name. The man at the front desk looked at her, the way men look at young women who arrive dirty and alone and ask for people by name. She let him look. Then she laid the draft letter from Silas Purdy on the counter and said, "I believe Mr. Stamp will want to see this today." Frederick Stamp was a spare, careful man with the kind of eyes that had spent 20 years reading numbers on dock slips and learned to notice when they didn't add up. He read Silas Purdy's letter once without expression. He read it again. He looked at Selah Dunbar over the top of the papers with the measuring look of a man deciding how much a source can be trusted, and she held his gaze the way Abel Ketty had taught her to hold a mallet, with the whole weight of yourself behind it, not just your arm. "Where is the ledger?" he asked. "In a safe place," she said. "I'll bring you to it." He came back to Harrow's Cove, with 2 constables from the county seat. Arriving by road, while she returned by the coastal path, she met them at the Marsh in the blue light of early morning and led them to the Dory on the gravel bar. She opened the hidden panel and laid the private ledger and the papers on the flat stone she had been using as a work surface. Frederick Stamp read for a long time. The constables waited. The gulls moved over the water in long, tilting arcs, indifferent to all of it. "This is Murchie's hand," he said at last. It was not a question. "Yes," she said, "and Silas Purdy's." Stamp looked at the date on Purdy's letter. He looked at the date of the last entry in Murchie's private ledger. He looked at the entry in the official fisheries record he had pulled from his own files. The entry showing Silas Purdy's dory found swamped and empty on a January morning with his oilskin still aboard and no trace of the man. He was quit for a long time, looking at those 3 dates arranged in sequence. "You've put yourself in considerable danger coming forward with this, Miss Dunbar." "I'm aware," she said. "That's why I came to you before I said a word to anyone else in Harrow's Cove." What followed was not fast, because legal things are rarely fast, but it was thorough. The federal inquiry into Victor Murchie's accounts moved through the county records like water through caulking seams, patient and finding every gap. Murchie was arrested 6 weeks after Selah walked into the Lunenburg office. The charge that held was fraud against a federally regulated fishing pool, which carried substantial weight. The question of what had happened to Silas Purdy remained open, but Murchie had the kind of face that broke under extended questioning in ways that said more than silence ever could. He did not come back to Harrow's Cove. The news moved through the village, the way news moves through small places, not in a single wave but in a series of small shocks, each one altering something. The fishermen of the pool were informed of the amounts they had been underpaid across 3 seasons. The total was enough to make the salt house go very quiet. People began, carefully at first, and then less carefully, to say things they had been keeping in their own kitchens for years. Selah received a finder's share from the federal restitution process. A formal document that felt strange in her hands, official and solid, awarding her a portion of the recovered funds as the individual who had brought the evidence forward. She read it 3 times, alone in the fish shack where she had been sleeping, to make certain she understood every line. There would be no question later about whether it was hers. It was enough to buy the workshop back. The transaction was handled by the county court administrator, Murchie's assets being under review, and the amount set for the workshop and cottage was fair value. Selah paid it. She signed the deed at a small desk in a small office, and the court clerk pressed the county seal into the wax with a finality that sounded, in that quiet room, like a door closing properly on something that had been left ajar too long. She walked back to the workshop in the last of the November light. The key in her hand was the same key. She had asked for it specifically, the original, and after a moment of searching the inventory drawer, the clerk had found it and given it to her without comment. The workshop was empty. It smelled of cold iron and old wood and the thin particular smell of a space that has been locked and unused. The tool hooks on the wall were bare. The workbench was bare. The floor had dried out from being swept with no work left to dirty it. She stood in the doorway for a long while, feeling the cold come in from the harbor behind her. Then she went to her pack, took out the oilcloth, and unwrapped the draw knife. She carried it to the workbench and laid it in the center, where it could be seen from the door. The boxwood handle glowed the color of old honey in the thin light from the small window. The blade was bright where she had kept it clean. It was Abel Keddy's draw knife, and it was hers, and the bench it lay on was hers, and the workshop around it was hers. Won back, not with money she had been given, but with money she had earned by seeing something worth seeing in a place where everyone else had simply stopped looking. She lit the small iron stove in the corner and stood, with her hands open toward the heat, and she thought about the dory in the marsh, about the panel that opened on a single hinge without a sound, about a man named Silas Purdy who had gathered evidence against a powerful man and hidden it carefully in the one place he thought was safe, and who had not lived long enough to deliver it himself. In a way, she thought, she had finished his last job for him. She had made the delivery he had never been allowed to make. A pot of fish chowder appeared on the step that evening, left there by Peg Coulter from the house at the top of the lane, with no note attached. Bart Can, the fisherman who had called down to her from the fence rail above the marsh, came by the next morning and stood in the doorway, long enough to look at the empty tool hooks, and then at Selah. And then, he said, with the directness of a man who has settled something in his own mind. "I've got a skiff with a sprung plank. Would you take a look at it?" "I would," she said. He left a smoked mackerel on the step when he went. She picked it up and went back inside to the bench and began to think about what tools she still needed to find. Selah Dunbar was 21 years old and had been for a short time without a floor to stand on. She had spent $8 on salvage rights to a wreck that everyone in Harrow's Cove had stopped seeing because it had always been there. It was, as it turned out, the best $8 she ever spent. We hope this story found you well tonight. If it did, we'd be grateful if you shared it with someone who might need to hear it. And before you go, we have one question we'd love you to answer in the comments below. Something we ask everyone, and something we genuinely read every single response to. What have you ever found real value in that everyone else had already written off? Tell us what it was.